We'll get started in just a minute here, folks. I'm still waiting for more people to join up in the class today. We only have 10 people in here right now, so ideally we'll wait until we get about twice that much. I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes before I get started. All right, well, I'm going to get started here, folks. I don't know where everybody is this morning, but we're just going to go ahead and get going here. We left off last time talking about the interwar years. And we were talking about some of the art changes. We talked about some science changes in physics with Albert Einstein. We talked about some changes in the field of psychology with Sigmund Freud and his understanding of the unconscious mind. We talked about some changes in literature with The Lost Generation and Ernest Hemingway. And now we've talked about art and changes in art and how art was really breaking a bunch of the conventional rules surrounding what is deemed art-worthy. And I even gave you the example of the Dada piece of art. We left off talking about Dada art, which was art that embraces chaos. And the whole message behind Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain The whole message behind the fountain is that it was this urinal and it's disgusting and is really not what most people would think of as a fountain, but the message basically being, if humans are rational, if humans are reasonable creatures who do things based on rational thought, then this is art. And the idea basically saying humans aren't rational, that art isn't rational, that people do things that are irrational. And the art itself was to embrace chaos. It was to embrace this sense of uncertainty that really characterizes the time of the interwar years, as we've been talking about. The spirit, the cultural spirit after World War I across mostly Europe, less so America, because as I mentioned, America wasn't as affected by World War I. Most Americans didn't have the length of time fighting the war and the degree of anger and bitterness and resentment that, for example, French folks had or British folks had, who fought the war for a lot longer period of time than Americans did. And also remember that none of the battles took place in America. So a lot of Americans who knew World War I was going on, but perhaps didn't serve in it or whatever, may not have really had the same degree of trauma that an event like World War I can cause for people. The other major cultural change that starts to take place during this time is music. We're seeing major changes in music by the time that we get to the 20th century. And many of the changes that we're seeing happen in music actually end up very much contributing to an evolution of popular music that takes place all the way through the 20th century. So it starts with jazz, right? Jazz music, well, it actually starts even before jazz. I can just give you a brief little history of music lesson here. So jazz is a kind of music that comes from America, particularly African Americans. And that's not to say that there weren't great white jazz musicians as well. There certainly have been throughout the last 100 and some years. But it originally emerges in the form of what's known as ragtime music. And I don't want my YouTube channel to get blocked for copyrighted material or anything like that, so I can't really play things for you right now, but I can give you some links if you'd like to take a look on your own to kind of this evolution of music that we're seeing happen during this time. Scott Joplin, Maple Leaf Rag. Maybe you've ever heard this song before. Let me copy this link here. You can click on that and listen to it. This is called ragtime music. Okay, maybe you've heard it before, maybe you haven't. This is a style of music that comes as a predecessor to jazz. It comes before jazz really comes around. The major difference between this kind of music and jazz is that jazz music has a certain swing to it. The feel of the music is different. And so whereas with this, it's played very straight. All the eighth notes, if you know anything about music, all the eighth notes are played directly straight. Swing music is okay, and so the jazz music has a different feel to it. It's got this kind of swing or this kind of lagging beat that creates a certain sound to it that we associate now with jazz music. But before that came around, this was the predecessor to jazz. And the reason that it's a predecessor to jazz is because it's using the piano and other instruments in a brand new way, emphasizing offbeats and syncopation. And you may not know what these terms mean off the top of your head, but basically it emphasizes unusual parts of the beat, and it's really unique and different. It's very different from the kind of classical music or folk music that was played in the 17 and 1800s. By the time that we get to the 1900s, the turn of the century, this is called ragtime music, okay? And ragtime music starts to become more popular. Shortly thereafter, we have a number of different kinds of movements through different eras of jazz. So before long, by the time that we get to the 20s, we hear songs like, oh gosh, let me see if I can find. Here we go. By the time that we get to the 1920s, we have music like this, and you can hear that this is going to be different. I'll let you have a listen to it. You've probably heard that one before. And then before long, we have a more radical form of jazz by the time that we get to the 1940s. Before we get to the 1940s, the music is picking up. And this is another style of jazz known as bebop, and it's faster and more improvisational. And so you can hear how the music is evolving over time. Eventually, of course, we'll move into the 1950s and 1960s with performers like Elvis and the Beatles. And they really introduced this blend of older music, of kind of country music, but also rock and roll style music, which were both heavily influenced by both blues and jazz. And over time, jazz, the improvisational qualities of jazz, and when you do improv, you're making it up as you go along. So if you're playing a jazz song and you take a solo, one of the things that's amazing about listening to jazz music is they are playing these instruments and they're just making it up as they play. And that's really a unique thing. Previous to this, we really didn't see much improvisation in music. But that same improvisational style eventually turns into the early forms of hip hop and rap music, because the improv starts to become poetic and lyrical. And so, if you've ever heard of freestyling before, or when performers just spit verses over a track. A lot of times if you're really good at rap, you're able to, rhyme words just off the top of your head. And like anything, of course, it takes a tremendous amount of practice. Very few people are born with the ability to just out of nowhere just really pick up and do awesome at just freestyling lyrics. It's really difficult. If you've ever tried it, it's something that is not easy to do. And so, when we think about more modern music from the last, say, 20 or 30 years, artists like Eminem or Tupac or Snoop Dogg or those guys, the old school rap dudes that were huge when I was growing up, were of course incredibly talented musicians. They have a particular skill set that allowed them to make incredible musical careers, and all of it really, when you boil it down and you look at the history of it, all of it can be traced back essentially to jazz music, this uniquely African American style of music that has spread across all cultures, really. Jazz is huge in Europe, just as like it is in America, and at this time in the 20s and 30s, jazz is spreading around the world, and it's really, it's very cool. It's neat to see this uniquely American cultural aspect of music proliferate and spread and have such a powerful influence on all the music that's come after it. Even a lot of the, you guys probably know, I have my little music thing that I do with my friend, and even the stuff that we make is informed by music theory, that largely is inspired going back to jazz. And you might not think it off the top of your head because it doesn't sound like jazz. When we think of jazz, we think of musical instruments like trombones and trumpets and saxophones and upright bass and stuff like that, and it's usually difficult to listen to and inaccessible. But the form of jazz, using chord progressions and stuff like that, is the very same kinds of techniques that most musicians use when they're making music. It's popular music that's informed by modern day chord progressions rather than by composers who are writing scores for giant symphonies and other things like that, and everything is very classically oriented. And so what music do I make? Well, you can check it out if you like. It's called, if you just search up recursive resonance on, no, we don't sing, it's all instrumental synthesizer music. Yeah, check it out. It's, and I'm not trying, honestly, kids, I'm not trying to promote myself here. I just do this for fun. I just think it's really fun to make music. But you're welcome to listen. I just try and be a positive role model. With my spare time, when I'm not doing teaching and grading and lesson planning and other things like that, when I get done with work at the end of the day, I go and I make music with a good friend of mine, and we started doing it about a year ago, and we just finished this live set. We're excited to be able to perform it. We're going to be doing a Twitch stream of a live performance of us playing our music. All of it's original, and it's just fun to do. It's just really gratifying. It's really fulfilling. And these are the kinds of things that make life worth living. It's just downright fun. I'm not doing it to get famous. I'm not doing it to get rich. I'm doing it because I like it, and it brings my life meaning. So if you like it, cool. If you don't like it, hey, it's not everybody's style of music. I get that. So anyway, continuing on here, we start to see new jazz clubs start to pop up. Arnav, the live stream, we haven't scheduled it yet. We're still practicing the live set to make sure that we have it all down and everything is balanced and sounds good. But it'll be announced here coming up soon on Instagram. probably within the next like few weeks here, probably in about two to 3 weeks, I would guess, would be when right around the start of March, probably will be when we do the live Twitch stream. Anyhow, we start to see new jazz clubs pop up. This is a very, very, very famous club called the Cotton Club, and it was in New York City. I don't think it's there anymore. It's been gone for a long time. But they used to have all these jazz clubs where people could go out and listen to live jazz music. And again, this is a new cultural phenomenon. You know, previous to this, there weren't really many places that you could go and just listen to popular music, and it was fun music. It was music that people wanted to dance to, and that's really what made it so great. You know, this kind of music wasn't. It was fun. It was exciting, and people previous to this, when you would go and listen to music, you'd be sitting in a theater, and you'd be sitting in a seat and watching a orchestra or a small ensemble on stage playing. You know, there weren't many opportunities for people to just go out to a club where there would be live music playing and you could dance and meet people and have a lot of fun. And that's really one of the main reasons that it takes off. And there's a bunch of different places like the Cotton Club. There was this place, Birdland and the Bandbox, and you could just go and listen to music and dance, and it was a fun time. And think about what people like music for today. You know, why are major concerts, you know, like Coachella and you name it, Sasquatch up in Washington or whatever, why do people go to those huge music festivals? It's because they want to let loose and have fun. They want to listen to music. They want to have a social experience and hang out with their friends. You know, they want to dance. People want to go out and have a good time. And that's what jazz music offered to a very downtrodden society after World War I. It was a way for people to escape kind of the uncertainty of the times and go and have some fun. And in the 1920s, it's really the height of the music boom in America, the Roaring '20s as they call it, where people were going out, and in particular, one of the aspects of people going out was women and their changing roles. And so, you know, previously in the 1800s, as we know, there were very rigid ideas about how women should act in public, and you know, it was a male-dominated culture, and so women a lot of times were expected to play these quiet, traditional, conservative roles. And when jazz music comes around, we see women who are now taking on new roles outside of the home. And that's what this slide talks about. You know, the war itself meant that we talked about, when we learned about World War I, we talked about something called total war. And what total war was when the entire civilian population, women included, were contributing to the war effort. And remember, when men were off fighting on the front lines in Europe, it left a lot of jobs untended in factories and stuff like that. And women came out and worked in the factories and started taking on these roles outside of working in the home, which is what they had more or less been expected to do for the last several hundred years. And so this war effort was really crucial in helping women gain the right to vote, because they basically said, you know, hey, when you needed women, we came out, we worked in factories, we kept the economy afloat while you were fighting the war. And how about a little bit of recognition for our contribution during World War I? And they start pushing harder for women's suffrage, which is also known as the right to vote. Remember that suffrage has nothing to do with suffering, Okay, that has nothing to do with it. Suffrage is voting rights. And so women gained the right to vote in about 1920, the year after World War I ends, and that's in large part due to the roles that they played outside of the home as the war was still going on. And it started in England, but eventually women's suffrage reaches Germany, Sweden, Austria, and the United States as well. Also, women's roles on just a purely cultural level. Here you can see how women were expected to act in the late 1800s, early 1900s. This is from probably about maybe about 1914 or so. But you can see the long traditional garb that women are wearing, very little skin showing, dark clothing, very conservative, and women were expected to kind of fit this traditional role. And the reason that women were so conscientious about dressing very conservatively and stuff is because they're trying to prove that they are responsible citizens who can be trusted with the right to vote. Okay, so this is a parade of some sort where this woman here is holding a flag, and this sign says this is the time to support women's suffrage, because at this time, as they're marching, these suffragettes here, or suffragists, are pushing the government to implement a constitutional amendment to allow women to vote. Also, we start to see styles change after World War I. After women get the right to vote, we see cultural changes with gender roles that allow for women to let their hair down, okay? And I do mean that quite literally. When we say kind of let your hair down, previously, women were expected to kind of keep their hair up in a bonnet, very conservative, and so on. They are no longer doing or practicing these conservative, restrictive hairstyles or clothing fashion trends, and instead their clothes are getting more, more provocative looking, shorter dresses, looser clothing. Women were starting to wear makeup. Makeup was something that in a previous time was really it was, in a previous time, makeup, the only women that would have been able to afford makeup in, an earlier era would have been relatively wealthy women, aristocratic, kind of highfalutin type of people. But as women are entering into the workplace and taking jobs outside of the home, working as nurses, working as telephone operators, working as teachers, working as factory workers or whatever, okay, they're starting to make more money. And as women start to pull in a better wage, they have more disposable income to spend that money on things like makeup, clothing, you name it. And also, previously in the 1800s, women were part of this movement of temperance. The temperance movement was to try to encourage society to give up alcohol in particular, because alcoholism had been a real problem in the United States during the Industrial Revolution. But in the 1920s, women themselves are now starting to consume alcohol. It was previously shunned for women to smoke. Smoking was viewed as mostly a male thing to do. Women start to smoke cigarettes in public. They're driving cars. Again, driving was something that was usually a male thing, and women are now starting to drive. Also, practices in terms of sexuality become more what can we say? They start to become more promiscuous, I guess is the most professional way that I can describe it. We start to see early forms of birth control emerge. Men and women are engaging in somewhat frivolous relationships and those kinds of things. And of course, women are coming out to these very same kinds of clubs, like the Cotton Club, like Birdland, over in New York City, that I showed you some images of a few minutes ago, and dancing. They are they're participating in popular culture, and we kind of see this revolution in women's gender roles where there's a lot more liberty for women to behave in a more modern way, rather than a more traditional conservative way. So and then women sought new careers also in medicine, education, journalism, and there were a whole bunch of jobs that were created with all the new technologies coming out, like telephones and stuff like that, radio, you name it, that women were starting to seek careers in, and so this too opened the door for basically a whole new cultural movement of women's liberation and women having more control over their own futures. So also we see new technologies emerge during the interwar years. Okay, as I mentioned, as difficult as the interwar years were on a cultural level for a lot of people in terms of how much faith they had in democracy or how much faith they had in humankind, it also brought with it this whole wealth of new ideas, new inventions, and medical technology really starts to go through its own renaissance during this time as well. One of the most amazing facts that in history that is really mind-blowing to me is you think about World War I. Okay, World War I was fought from 1914 to 1918. Okay, and it basically comes to an end with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. But during that time, think about all the injuries that people are coming home with. Medical technology was still extremely primitive in the years of World War I. And the fact that I was going to tell you that just is mind-blowing to me is you have these people that have these just gruesome injuries. They're in these disgusting trenches that are just, swarming with rats and disease and illness and so on. And meanwhile, you also have the Spanish flu epidemic happening, and a lot of people are dying from that. And while all of that is going on, they still haven't invented penicillin, the most basic and original antibiotic that we still prescribe for infections today. Now, of course, antibiotics don't do anything for viruses. You can't, that's why antibiotics don't work for COVID. COVID is a virus. Antibiotics only kill bacteria, okay? But you think about the kinds of infections that people no doubt got from their injuries that they sustained in World War I, and they literally didn't even have penicillin to treat basic infections during that time. In fact, penicillin doesn't get invented until 10 years after World War I ends, and that's what this relates to this slide here. New drugs like penicillin, antibiotics, okay, which have saved millions and millions and millions of lives since the 1920s, are only invented in the 1920s. And we see new medical treatments emerging for the first time in decades. As I said, medical technology was extremely slow to develop. Anything that we consider to be modern medicine is really something that has only been around for the last, I'll say, 50 to 80 years. Okay, not that long of a time, certainly within a single person's lifetime. So these kinds of advancements are really promising for the future, and again, it opens up all new avenues of medical research and technology and so on that continue to develop and evolve throughout the decades that follow. So by the time that we get to the 1960s, medical technology is 10 times better than it was 30 years earlier. By the time that we get to the 1990s, it's 10 times better than that. And by the time that we're now in the 2020s, our medical technology has really grown to amazing heights where we have really advanced machinery and advanced surgeries that we're able to perform that would have been something from a science fiction novel just 80 years ago. Improved transportation and communication after World War I ended. What do we see? We see more people buying cars. We see more people buying phones. We see more people having electricity in their houses. We see more people having radios in their houses that are delivering the news immediately to people across the nation. And this rapid boost in technology really is the first time that we see immediate access to global information as it comes out. Newspapers were always delayed. You have to write up the story, you have to print out the newspapers, and then you have to hand out the newspapers to people. Okay, that takes time. With the radio, a news bulletin can come in right away, and if you're listening to the radio, it comes over it immediately, and you know the news right as it is happening. Very similar to how it is today, right? With the internet, this has only gotten even more immediate. Our access, something could happen across the planet. Somebody could throw out a tweet about an event that happens, say in Lebanon, like it did not that long ago with that giant explosion in Beirut, Lebanon, a few months ago, and people know about it immediately. Or Notre Dame Cathedral is on fire. Boom, immediately people know about it across the entire planet because of that improved communication. Now, of course, what they had in those times is still a far cry from what we have today, but nonetheless, this immediate communication of the radio really transformed society, and radios became the center the center fixture in people's living rooms. People, at the end of the day, when dad got home from work, mom got home from work, kids got home from school, and dinner was made and stuff like that, the family would gather around the radio, and there would be all sorts of different kinds of programs on the radio. There'd be news programs, there'd be comedy programs, there'd be music, there'd be murder mysteries, dramas, and other radio things where you were just listening. There was no TV at this time. TVs don't come around until the 1950s, really. And so, inside the home, the number one fixture of technology was really the radio. And so anyhow, and then the president too would come on and give addresses. Particularly FDR did these fireside chats and would get on the radio, and people would listen to the president speak. And during World War II and stuff like that, it was really an amazing piece of technology, and it was unlike anything people had ever had before. Automobiles. During the war, innovations started to improve cars. So previously, if you ever heard of the word crank up the car, okay, literally early cars had cranks on the front of them, like a giant handle that you would have to turn yourself manually to get the car engine started. After the war, we start to see new things emerge, like electric starters in cars, where now you can literally just turn the key to the car and the car will start up electrically. And those electric starters were powered by things like batteries, which start to be added to cars. They start putting, previously, old cars had solid, like, wagon wheel tires on them, okay, wagon wheels on them. And the cars were pretty bumpy and uncomfortable. They start introducing air-filled tires, which make your ride much smoother because the air operates as a cushion for the whole car. And they improve the suspension on cars. They start putting more powerful engines into cars. They redesign the cars. Previously, cars used to look really blocky, kind of cheaply made, not very aerodynamic, not super comfortable, and kind of almost cheap looking, kind of flimsy looking. There were no safety precautions like seat belts in cars and stuff like that in the early days. By the time that we get to the 1930s, increasingly cars are being designed to look sleeker, to look more polished, to have headlights, tail lights, bumpers. All of the things that we consider to be just regular features on cars really don't start to be added to cars until the late 20s, early 30s. So let me tell you kind of what I mean here. Here you can see kind of the wagon wheel looking car or tires that were put on cars in 1913. And then, you know, these cars, again, they had some suspension to them, but for the most part, the cars were uncomfortable. They were bumpy. They weren't particularly fast, okay, and they're not very comfortable. They are also pretty expensive, and so it was difficult for people to be able to afford cars, and a lot of people still used horses and carriages before World War I. By the time that we get to World War II, after the interwar years, you can see just how different these car designs are, okay? A car from 1937 had really nice, sleek lines on it. They were completely enclosed. They had things like fixed windshields, headlights, grills, bumpers, air-filled tires, you know, these kinds of things, better suspension, more powerful engines. The cars became much, much faster. And also they started to become more affordable because people were making more money during the 1920s. The economy was doing really well, and people started saving up their money and buying automobiles. Airplanes was another way in which technology improved significantly after World War I. Now, they did have planes in World War I, but the kinds of planes that they had would have been pretty scary planes to be in. They were mostly biplanes, those planes that have 2, sometimes even 3 wings. They kind of look something like this. Okay, now this isn't maybe the best example because this is kind of a glider water float plane from early days. But early planes kind of had this bi-wing structure. The planes were pretty fragile. A stiff wind could have easily really caused you problems with your plane because they were lightweight, and they didn't travel particularly fast. They traveled fast enough to fly, but they're not like really, really fast. And also planes at this time had a really limited range because you could only put so much fuel on the plane to keep it light enough where it can still get off the ground. And so planes during World War I were, you know, largely open cabin planes. They had bi-wing planes or sometimes even tri-wing planes. But by the time that we get to other designs of planes that break out in World War II, look at how different the planes look. You know, they really are much more modern looking. Even this isn't that modern looking anymore, you know, because most planes don't even have propellers on them anymore because our planes now have jet engines on them. We don't need propellers on the planes because the jet engines are far more powerful and can propel the plane far faster than a propeller could. So, but anyhow, 2 British pilots were the first ones in 1919 to make the first successful flight across the Atlantic Ocean. And I want to bring up another interesting fact about that just to show how fast technology is developing during this time, which is that if you think about steam engines, when we learned about the Industrial Revolution, steam engines were really only invented at the tail end of the 1700s. And they don't start putting steam engines onto things like boats until the early 1800s. We don't see the first steamboat cross the Atlantic Ocean until I think 1838 or something like that. And so I want you to think about that for a second, because we go from using wind-powered sails on boats, on ships, okay, that take, you know, the ship maybe 20 to 30 days to cross the Atlantic Ocean, all right, to in 1838 using steam engine powered boats to travel across the ocean. And then just 80 years later, in 1919, we see the first successful airplane flight across the Atlantic Ocean, which you think about that, it's amazing that we go from inside of 200 years, we have gone from basically using sailboats to get across the ocean to now, in our modern day times, we have massive jumbo jets that could take hundreds and hundreds of people across the ocean in a matter of hours, safely and quickly. And so really this technology has developed just astronomically, you know, and then you don't even, I'm not even mentioning the other side of it, which is that we have spacecrafts. We have the International Space Station that's just orbiting around Earth. Okay, all of this has happened within the last 200 years. And so technologically, we have come so far compared to the way that technology was just 200 years ago, in a time when we were barely, and I do mean barely, adding steam engines to boats, you know, for the first time ever. It's absolutely remarkable. We also see airplanes that are used for commercial travel. So we start to see the first kinds of passenger planes. They're not jets yet. As you can see on this plane here, and I'll show you another angle of it that might be a little easier to see, you can see some of these propellers on this plane here. They don't even have jet engines on them yet. And the planes, of course, planes these days are much, much bigger than this plane is here. But it would, if you showed up to the airport and you were expected to board this plane, you were going to wonder if you're going to get to your destination, because it looks old and archaic in its design. It's got these massive bi-wings here again. But it wouldn't be long before we start to see innovations to commercial planes as well. And you can see here another example of a commercial style plane that would have held many passengers, again with the different propellers up here on the wing. And it's a truly remarkable thing. We are now in an age of flight. Okay, so radios and movies. This is another way in which technology is developing. I was talking a little bit about radios earlier. Radio development was initially a military technology, right? You know, people didn't have radios at home, and even if they did, it wouldn't have been useful for anything because there were no radio stations prior to World War I. We don't see radio towers and private radio stations start to develop until 1920, after World War I ends. And so the first commercial radio station was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And eventually, within a very short period of time, radios start sweeping through the US and eventually through the whole world. So that soon, particularly in America and in Europe, most families had a radio, and radios were another commercial item that people were regularly buying and factories were regularly producing. Here's an example of a radio called a Philco radio. I actually have a Philco radio sitting directly behind me, very similar to the one that you see here. It's not exactly the same, but it's close. And once again, you can see the Art Deco design here. Curved, it has these kind of curved sides to it, yet linear. Has these really nice lines on it. And so anyhow, it's these are the kinds of things, and people, you look at the price of them, $36 to $295. You have to understand this is 1930s money that we're talking about here, maybe even 1920s money. Okay, so $295 in 1920 would be the equivalent of something like $5,000 today or something. Okay, a huge, huge, huge amount of money. And people were, of course, willing to pay it if they had it, because these were not only functional in the sense that they provided radio broadcasts and entertainment and stuff, but they were also beautiful. It was a sign of wealth. If you had a nice radio like this in your house, it was deemed to be, you know, look at this person. They're, you know, they're wealthy, or they're doing well. You know, they're well off. Okay, they're rich. Okay, and so these are the kinds of furniture pieces, radios, that people are putting in their houses. Motion pictures are another major aspect of the 1920s and 30s that we see come around. Photography was still relatively young at this point. It had been around for maybe about 100 years, maybe not quite 100 years by the time that the 1920s, 1930s come around. But eventually what people realize is you could have, and the way that motion pictures were done is that you have a strip of film, okay? And you take a bunch of pictures back to back to back to back, and when you look at them through a film projector, as the film passes in front of the light, as the film passes in front of the light projects through the film on a screen. And the film is moving at a rate so quickly that the human eye can't discern that it's actually looking at a bunch of back-to-back still images, because you're looking at 15 to 20 still images a second. And this gives the impression of movement on the screen. So motion pictures, movies, as they're called, okay, are a bunch of pictures taken back to back to back to back. And once you look at them very, very quickly, your mind perceives those still images as moving. And in the early days of motion pictures, movies didn't have sound or music. They were silent. And you would show up to the movie theater and you would watch a movie, but there would be a piano player in the front of the movie theater. And the piano player would be paid to play the music that accompanies the movie. And so, if you think about old-timey movies where, the woman is tied up on the railroad tracks and there's a steaming locomotive coming down the tracks, and, you hear the, it's like, that kind of old-timey, tense music that plays, that would all be played on a piano live in the movie theater as you were watching the movie. Let's see here. Did they make a lot of money? Did who make a lot of money, Isaiah? Let me ask you that. Did the movies? Did the actors? Who are you referring to there? Oh, the piano players. No, I doubt the piano players in the theaters made a whole lot of money. That was probably just like a regular wage labor type job that they were doing. They were making probably just regular money that a person working at a movie theater would make, as you would expect. Not that much money. The actors, you could have actors that made a lot of money though. There were some very, very, very famous silent film actors. In fact, we were going to talk about one here, Charlie Chaplin. You may have heard of Charlie Chaplin before or seen Charlie Chaplin. This is Charlie Chaplin right here. Okay? And Charlie Chaplin was really the biggest movie star in Hollywood in the 1920s and 1930s. Charlie Chaplin was a comedic actor. And did a bunch of physical comedy on screen. But the thing about silent films is because they didn't have sound, the acting in silent films, we look back at it today as being pretty over the top, pretty exaggerated, okay? And when sound enters into movies and movies start to be recorded with actual audible sound, and you can hear the actors speaking lines in the movies. Previously, there were no lines in movies because there was no sound in movies. And so every so often the movie would stop and you'd see a blank black screen with white text on it that lets the audience know, kind of the plot line of what's going on here. And you'd have to read the screen and then it would go back to the movie. That's how early movies were made. When they start recording movies with sound, they don't have to do that anymore because the actors are speaking lines in the movie. And this changed movies forever because the major actors that were huge during the silent film era were really out of work in an era when sound starts to accompany movies, because they were trying to continue to do the same kinds of things that made them successful in silent films in speaking roles. And they just weren't, they were kind of a fish out of water because they weren't used to delivering lines in movies. The actors that had been big in silent films a lot of times were out of work when sound entered into movies because, you know, they didn't have the kind of quality necessary to be a successful sound talking picture actor. And so, but Hollywood really, the heyday of Hollywood was in the 1920s and 30s when you started to have these motion pictures with sound and music and eventually even color. You know, color film starts to be introduced by the time that we get into about the 1940s, 1950s. Okay, color films start to become much more popular. But the first picture, the first movie that ever had sound in it was known as The Jazz Singer. And they called them, at first, they called them talking pictures because you could go to the movie and the actors, you could hear them talking their lines on screen. And you could hear music and stuff like that. Movies started to have soundtracks where orchestras would play music or jazz bands big bands would play jazz music along with the plot line of the movie. And so these kinds of things completely revolutionized movies. The other thing that's really significant about movies is that in 1929, the stock market crashes. And another interesting fact is that movies back in the olden days used to be, by modern day standards, really, really long. It was not uncommon for movies to be 3 or 4 hours long. And you think about that, it's like, holy smokes, that's a long movie, right? Like these days, that's a commitment. If you're going to watch Lord of the Rings, or if you're going to watch the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, you're going to be spending your whole day doing that. I mean, the movies are hours and hours long. They're long, long films. But whereas today, that's kind of a rare thing, back in this time, long movies were the order of the day. And people wanted the movies to be long precisely because when the stock market crashes, movies were a real cheap form of entertainment. You could go and pay, you know, a nickel or a quarter or something like that and have essentially a full day's worth of entertainment. And it would allow you to escape from the drudgery of your life during the Great Depression, because a lot of people's lives were completely ruined by the economic depression after the stock market crashes. So on a Saturday or on a Sunday, you could go, you know, in the late morning time, maybe about 11 o'clock or noon, you could go to your movie theater. They would you pay your quarter. They had refreshments and things like that. You could go and sit in the theater. The first 10, 20 minutes of it would be a newsreel. They would tell you about all the news that was happening around the world. This is nowadays, all the movie theaters are closed because of COVID. It's been forever since I've gone and seen a movie in a theater. But when people first started doing that, you know, these days you go to the theater, there's some previews for movies and there's some advertisements and stuff like that. But then you watch your movie and you leave. Okay, you're there for maybe a couple hours. Back in the olden days, you could show up, you could be there from noon until 5 p.m. You know, and it would be a cheap form of getting your mind off of your life, off of maybe the depression, maybe the fact that you're in a bunch of debt or whatever it is, and watch a movie and be entertained and laugh and learn some things too, because you'd show up, they'd have that 10 to 20 minute newsreel where they tell you everything that's going on. You know, if you went and saw a movie during World War II, they would always have a newsreel to show you, you know, what's happening in the war and stuff like that. There would be war photographers whose films would make it into these newsreels and things. And then there'd usually be like a short cartoon Merry Medleys, Mickey Mouse, Bugs Bunny, those kinds of characters start coming around, and you watch a Mickey Mouse short, like a little cartoon animation sort of a thing. And then you would start your feature presentation. But by that point, you've already been at the movie theater for 45 minutes to an hour. And then you watch your movie. And the movie typically would have intermissions in it. So you'd watch the first half of the movie, there would be a break. There would be an intermission of 20 to 25 minutes. People get up, they go to the bathroom, they buy more refreshments, whatever. And then you go back to watch the second half of the movie. By the end of the day, you've been there 5 hours. And you go home and you've had a nice full day of hanging out at the movie theater and getting some entertainment and watching some news and stuff like that. Pretty cool. All right, folks. Well, that brings us to the end of the first section of this PowerPoint, which is where I wanted to get to today. I've been talking at you for about an hour here. I just wanted to let you know we do have a 3-day weekend coming up here, just like we did last weekend. And over this 3-day weekend, I am going to be making an assignment for you that I will put up shortly here that will be due on Wednesday, because that will be the next time that I see you. I'd like to just gently ask you guys if you could help me out by just submitting your assignments on time. That would really be helpful to me, because it's really hard for me to stay organized with the class if I'm constantly having to go back and deal with people sending me messages. You know, I don't give you guys that much homework, and I'm doing that on purpose. So when I do assign homework to you, if you could please do it and hand it in on time, that really helps me do my job better. So I'd really like to stress you to get that stuff handed in on time. And some of you, like Venkata just said, some of you are really good about that. That's great. And if you're great at it, that's awesome. Just keep doing what you're doing. But for those of you that are kind of characteristically late on your assignments, if you could just help me out and get those in on time, that just makes my job a million times easier, and it keeps your grade updated and all that stuff, and we don't have to worry about headaches. So I'll be putting up that assignment shortly. I have to still make it for Canvas, but I will be putting that assignment up so that you can get that done over the weekend, and we will see you back here on on Wednesday morning. All right, folks. Enjoy your weekend, get that assignment done, hand it in on time, and we'll see you back on Wednesday. Have a great day.